The title of our next talk, Protein, Particularly at Breakfast, on Appetite, Satiety, and Weight Management in Adolescents by Dr. Heather Leidy of Purdue University. Heather is an associate professor and director of the NIH-supported Clinical Research Center in the Department of Nutrition Science at Purdue University, which I believe you just started this semester, right? She was for several years at the University of Missouri in Columbia. She received her BS degree in biology from Shippensburg University and taught junior high biology in the Pennsylvania public school system for several years. She then went on to complete her MS and PhD in physiology at Penn State, as well as a postdoctoral fellowship in the Department of Nutrition and the Ingestive Behavior Research Center at Purdue University. As a nutritional physiologist, she incorporates a pipette to dinner plate approach by examining the eating behavior signals by which the consumption of increased dietary protein improves weight management in humans. This line of research has led to the development of novel dietary strategies for the prevention and treatment of obesity and type 2 diabetes. Specific focus areas include the effects of protein quantity, quality, and timing of consumption on the appetite, hormonal, and neural signals controlling appetite, satiety, and food cravings. She has over 50 original research publications and has given over 100 invited research talks in this area. In 2015, Dr. Leidy received the American Society of Nutrition Mead Johnson Nutrition Award to young investigators in recognition of outstanding research in environmental and nutritional physiology. The award was based on her most recent work, focusing on the importance of consuming a high-protein breakfast for satiety, glycemic control, and weight management in overweight young people who habitually skip breakfast. Her funding has included both industry sources and the National Institutes of Health. So please welcome Dr. Leidy to our presentation.
So it's great to be here. This is a slightly different type of talk than what you heard earlier. You know, I do a lot of work with adolescents, and so even attempting to modify their entire diet is a feeble task, right? So what we do is really focus on one key aspect, and that being breakfast. And so it'll come full circle. And then this is a really good segue with some of the talks that you'll hear later on today. And so with that, we'll go ahead and get started. So the background, as far as with my talk, is, you know, we started looking at breakfast, and I'll give some reasons why, but, you know, you've all heard at least, 20 or 30 years ago that everybody says, mom says breakfast is the most important meal of the day. And I think I even have a one paper that actually says that. And so I did a quick Google search not too long ago just to look at breakfast and what people say about it. And you'll see this. I mean, across the boards, it's deemed that it's healthy, and if you eat breakfast, you'll lose weight and you have better health and well-being. But the issue is the science supporting this? And maybe a year or a year and a half ago, you've probably heard in the media that it doesn't matter whether you should have breakfast or not. And so, the goal of my talk today is to illustrate this with research and concerning the importance of having a breakfast, and then one that's higher in protein today. And so this is in the lay press, and so we're skeptical at this point whether you're a dietitian or a physician or whatnot, or a researcher. But then taking it a step further, these are some of the key scientific communities that actually also focus on breakfast. So we know the Academy, the American Diabetes Association, Pediatrics, the National Weight Control Registry, and then the 2010 Dietary Guidelines for Americans. They all include some component of breakfast, and that being that breakfast consumption is a fundamental pillar for promoting weight management and other health benefits. So again, they're out saying that breakfast is important and we should include this within a healthy dietary pattern. What is the science there? And so I always talk about, show me the evidence. Well, what is there? And that's what we all try to do. And so what it's based on is this illustration here on the right-hand side. This is some survey data from the National Food Consumption Survey and then some NHANES, just illustrating the frequency of breakfast consumption over the past 50 years. The red is in children, the blue is in adolescents, and then the black are in adults. And you can see about 50 years ago, nearly 100% of Americans consume breakfast on a daily basis. But you see that there's a steady decline over the course of 20, 30, 40 years, showing that there's a decline in breakfast consumption. On the bottom panel, this is the obesity rates, and you can see that mirrors the rise in obesity. All right, and so this is, I think, where we're getting a lot of that lay press. They see these relationships and they automatically assume cause and effect. Right? But again, it is not a causal relationship. It's just showing this association. We also know that there's an association with everything unhealthy, right? Sugar sweetened beverages, inactivity, anything under the sun that is deemed unhealthy is also associated with obesity. So really, how powerful is this concept with breakfast? Well, there have been over 100 prospective cross-sectional studies that illustrate the following relationship, such that breakfast skipping is associated with a greater BMI, greater body weight, greater weight gain and body fat gain, and a greater prevalence of obesity. All right, again, strong associations, right? So I just want to hammer that home, that that's really what, until the last couple of years, is that's what we've based most of our recommendations on. A few years ago, David Allisons' group at, I'm drawing a complete blank on where he is right now. UAB, thank you, did a meta-analysis on breakfast skippers and weight loss, and showed that breakfast skippers have a greater odds ratio of being classified as overweight. And that's P to the minus 10 to the minus 42, right? So big. I was going to put all the zeros in, but frankly, it would fill up the entire page. As a scientist, as a younger scientist, we attempt for 0.05, right? And so this really illustrates this is a significant, powerful association, but an association nonetheless. All right, and so the issue is there's an extremely limited number of long-term trials assessing a causal link between breakfast and weight loss. And I promise, give me a couple minutes and I go full circle with including this concept of protein at breakfast. All right, the one that I'm going to show as of late was completed by David Allisons' group last year, and it was a 16-week randomized control trial in over 300 adults. They were stratified to breakfast habits, and then they were randomized into 3 different groups. There was a control group, and within that group, they were just provided a USDA pamphlet that said, "Let's eat for the health of it." All right. And within that pamphlet, it was just really talking about ways of eating healthy, but not focusing on breakfast. And then they had a breakfast group in which the volunteers were given the same pamphlet with another handout to eat breakfast before 10 a.m. Again, no mention of what types of breakfast foods you should consume, just that you should eat breakfast. And then another group that were skippers that were given the same pamphlet, and then another one that said that don't eat before 11 in the morning. All right, and their primary outcome was looking at changes in body weight over this 16-week period. All right, and here's what they found. They adjusted for a lot of different subject characteristics: age, race, site, gender, pre-randomization status, and so forth. And what they consistently found is that there is no difference in terms of whether you have breakfast or whether you skip breakfast from a weight standpoint, that all groups equally lost the same amount of weight. And so really illustrating this concept that from a public health standpoint, there is really no recommendations that we can make to eat breakfast or not to eat breakfast. All right. And as soon as this came out, it was followed by a press release, which they generally are. And then everything blows up in the media. Right. And so there's a Time magazine came out with 5 fascinating facts about breakfast that it really probably doesn't matter. Washington Post came out and said, well, all the science nutritionists in the world have really gotten it wrong, that it really doesn't matter. And they based it on this single study. And along the way, we were doing acute trials with breakfast and then even some longer term trials. And so it was a really good intersection because we're even talked about within this paper, because the limitations with this study is the fact that they didn't look at other key health related outcomes. They didn't focus on glycemic control or even appetite and satiety or changes in body composition. And then they also didn't really focus on this idea of breakfast type. And in essence, does breakfast type matter? Well, I really spent the majority of my research over the past 10 years really looking at increased dietary protein and its effects on weight management from different aspects. And so this is just a summary. I would love to go into research into this, but the folks in the afternoon are really going to hammer this home. And so I'm just going to broadly summarize this concept of what increased dietary protein can do is in terms of proposed benefits. And so, a lot of what is proposed for increased protein is this idea of weight management, fitness and performance, and then reducing the risk of a lot of chronic diseases, primarily obesity and type 2 diabetes. And when you look at a lot of the energy restriction trials out there, there are main pieces of the puzzle, if you will, which is what you consistently see. Keep in mind, the studies that that are within this global summary are not ketogenic per se. They're not high protein, high fat, low carb. These are the ones that, in essence, that you're just replacing carbohydrates with protein. When you look at a lot of these trials, on average, the protein per kilogram of body weight per day is about 1.2 to 1.6. So keep in mind that's twice as much as the RDA. But again, it's well within that AMDR, that acceptable macronutrient distribution range that Kelly talked about earlier, which is about 25 to 30% of daily intake. When you look at those studies that use that same framework, you do see that this idea of increased protein compared to standard protein diets lead to a greater weight loss, greater fat loss, and then the ability to retain lean mass or muscle during weight loss compared to standard protein diets. Less is clear with respect to reducing daily food intake, but there's a few studies that actually had individuals eat a certain amount of protein, and they found that when they do that, you voluntarily or spontaneously reduce your intake on carbohydrates and fats. All right, but really not definitive. There's really only 2 studies that have supported that. So they're really the main key pieces. And then we start looking at mechanisms. We know that eating more protein is metabolic. You do get an increase in resting as well as postprandial energy expenditure, but that's only about 80 calories. So in the whole context of weight management, the driving force is most likely not because protein is metabolic in terms of increasing your energy expenditure. Stu and Doug will spend some time talking to you about protein synthesis and the fact that eating protein at a certain amount can stimulate protein synthesis, which downstream has an effect on lean mass gains. What we focus is on the other end of the energy spectrum, that being, well, if eating protein leads to reductions in daily food intake, does it do it through appetite control and satiety? And there's a lot of other branches in terms of appetite and satiety. I mean, you can approach it from the fact of, yes, I want to have a healthy diet, and so I want to reduce those desires to eat more food than I should. But then we also know that it has to do with cognitive function. Glycemic control is also paired in with that. And so there's a lot of other benefits with curbing appetite for some other health outcomes. And so I pose this because, the issue is, well, how do you define appetite control and satiety? And so this, we can all relate to this, I'm assuming. If we've skipped a meal or we're trying to lose weight, or you're recommending to a client to do an energy restriction, it's very tangible, right? He's obviously not eaten at least one meal, if not more. And this is called homeostatic hunger, right? It's energy sensing. And so our body senses the lack of available energy, and it responds accordingly. We have gut signals that are activated, and that downstream lead to this drive for hunger. And it's very tangible, and we have all experienced that. But we also have this, right? And so after a full course meal, the dessert tray comes out, or, in this case, a kid comes home from school and a cupcake sitting on there, and we are now hungry. Right, but it has nothing to do with energy needs. It has to do with the fact that these are rewarding, and we want that, and we seek those foods out, and that's hedonic or reward-driven behavior. And so it's really this combination of both of these that are driving us to eat. On the other hand of the spectrum is we have homeostatic satiety. So after a meal or after a high-protein breakfast, you have this feeling of fullness. You have gut hormones that respond accordingly, and you have this feeling of satiety that actually prevents you from continuing to eat, as well as preventing you from eating later on. And then more from a reward standpoint is, once you have a bite of a piece of cake, you actually have a dopamine response that leads to this feeling of satisfaction. We eat the whole thing, right? Anyways, outside of the fact that it is satisfying for other reasons. And so that's the other tricky part when you look at appetite control and satiety, is that there's so many environmental factors at play that are really driving us to eat or not to eat. But from our lab and from others, we try to dissect those. And then really with the halo, what does protein affect each of these different types of eating behaviors? And again, just to summarize, and I'll have very specific research points here in a little bit. We do see that when you have a higher protein diet or a high protein meal, you get a decrease in homeostatic hunger as well as hedonic hunger. Your food cravings are less. You also get an increase in homeostatic satiety and this idea of satisfaction. All right. And so globally, as a summary, your take-home message is, yes, we do see that all these pieces of the puzzle are fitting together with this idea of eating more protein. What we try to focus on then is coming full circle is, well, do you see a very similar effect when you just are looking at a high protein breakfast? All right, so really going back to this concept that if breakfast skipping is related to obesity, can incorporating a high protein breakfast actually, prevent or treat that and reverse the epidemic that we have? And so again, well, why are we focusing on breakfast? Well, the first aspect is we did a real quick short-term trial a few years back when I was a postdoc, really assessing whether eating protein in the morning versus at lunch or dinner had a difference in satiety. There was really no science behind it. It was one of those musclehead moments. You're like, well, hey, I wonder, does it really matter? Do you get these differences? And so we did that study. Within that, the volunteers came in and either had a high protein breakfast followed with a normal protein lunch and dinner, or they had a high protein lunch followed by normal, or a high protein dinner with a normal breakfast and lunch. And here's what we found. This is looking at perceived feelings of fullness over the 3-hour period. And we see that that all meals increased fullness, but the high protein breakfast led to a greater feeling of fullness compared to when the protein was consumed at lunch or at dinner. All right, you can see the normal protein meals were right here in the mix, really suggesting that to get the maximum amount of satiety, you really need to have that protein in the morning. We carried that trial out for an entire 12-hour day. And interestingly, we found that immediate increase in fullness after breakfast was sustained throughout the entire day, even into going to bed, compared to whenever that protein was consumed at lunch or at dinner. All right, again, supporting this concept of eating protein in the morning. And then, when I go full circle with this idea of breakfast consumption, this is looking at some NHANES data of protein consumption across the day. And you're going to see this probably one or if not 2 times today. So now I can dig that I got to do this first. It's great going in the morning. So this is really the amount of protein that's consumed at breakfast, lunch, and at dinner, as well as snacks. And we can see here that at breakfast, it's actually fairly dismal in breakfast consumers. It's about 10 grams of protein in the morning. And so that's another really good target that, if protein is magical or it's novel in the morning and you lead to this feeling of satiety, then, let's target the groups that are not really eating that much protein. And then again, this blanket concept is this idea of about 60% of adolescents skip breakfast frequently. And we also are starting to see that parents are doing the same thing as well. So again, a really good target to take this concept of skipping breakfast and insert this idea of high protein breakfast in the morning. And so we did a series of, And so the first question, we have done a series of breakfast studies, but the first and foremost really thing that we need to do is, well, how much protein do they need in the morning, right? And so Doug Penn-Jones and I have published a paper in which we did a retrospective analysis of all of my previous studies. These were short-term studies, and what we were trying to see is, well, is there a certain optimal amount of protein in the morning, or a threshold, if you will, that we need to do to elicit satiety? And so within those studies, they were 350 calorie meals, and the proteins varied. And so we gave either 15, 20, 25, or 30 grams within these different studies. And then in this analysis, we were just looking at perceived fullness over that next 2-hour period. And so visibly here, and then this is the statistical part of really summing the data, we can see that the 30-gram, well, let me take a step back, that all meals led to an increased feeling of fullness, right? They were 350 calorie meals. They were mixed meals, but the one that had 30 grams of protein led to a greater feeling of fullness compared to the other ones. All right, and that's illustrated here from a statistical manner that only the 30-gram protein meal led to a greater feeling of fullness or satiety compared to 15, 20, and 25. And 2 points here. The first one is that you don't see a dose response. And what I mean by that is that 20 wasn't better than 15 and 25 wasn't better than 20, right? So you don't see this stepwise progression of satiety. It shows that you theoretically need 30 grams to elicit that ample feeling of satiety that downstream actually led to alterations in food intake. And so that really is more along the lines of this potential optimal threshold, if you will, for protein. And so once we did these types of studies, then really that next step was, okay, well, these were breakfast studies. Let's take this 30 grams and incorporate it into these diets of teens who are skipping breakfast. All right, so we did, as I said, a series of studies. Some were short-term and some were long-term. I'm just going to highlight a few of the findings within these. And what we do with these studies is there's 7 days. The acute trials are 7 days. There's 6 days of acclimation. And so for 6 days, they either continue to skip breakfast or they eat a normal protein breakfast or high protein breakfast. And then we test them on day 7. And the reason we do that is that there's the fatal flaw, if you will, for short-term trials is that they come in on a single day. And so you don't really know what your outcomes are and whether they're impacted by the fact that that's a novel food or a novel meal. All right. And so what we found is it takes about 3 days for your appetite and satiety to stabilize. And so when we carry that out for 7 days, then we have a better idea of looking at, even though it's short term, we can make some generalizations in terms of the long-term implications from that. All right. So this wasn't a true acute trial in the sense that we did do these 7 days. All right, and so obviously breakfast skipping, this is the dietary characteristics of that. So the skippers continue to skip breakfast. The normal protein were based on cereals, and you can see that both of these, the normal protein and the high protein, were 350 calories. Our high protein meals, which I'll show you a picture of, is they were, they look like home cooked or home prepared meals, but we made them in the research lab. So we didn't really want to call them research prepared because that sounds gross. All right, so I think we just called them prepared and moved on. The biggest reason I get asked all the time is, why did you do cereals versus these prepared meals? Because they're different. Well, when you look at teens that are actually eating breakfast, they're eating cereals. And so we wanted to do a scientific comparison, but we also wanted to make it practical. And in the cereals, rightly so, because generally the only protein that's in there is the milk, you get a lower protein content. And so that was about 13 grams of protein. And you can see that our higher protein versions were about 30 grams of protein. And what we do here is we modulate carbohydrates and protein, and we keep fat constant. Within these trials, we also matched energy density, sugar, and fiber, which is a daunting task, but we did that because all of these things also affect appetite control and satiety. All right, so this was a very tightly controlled trial, and this is what they look like. They're very common. These were cereals, the Chex and Cheerios, and they could pick these throughout the 7-day period. And then we also had, this is a Greek yogurt egg waffle with a lean beef or lean pork sausage patty, depending on the study. And this is your typical breakfast burrito with lean meat, eggs, and dairy as well. And so you can see here the differences that we're comparing. Within the short-term trial, the volunteers came in on these 3 separate days, and we put a catheter in their arm to take repeated blood sampling because we look at these gut hormones that are tied to appetite and satiety, and I'll show you a few examples of them. But in short, there's really only one known hunger hormone. It's ghrelin. It rises right before you eat, and it leads to eating initiation. It drops to really low levels, and you see this fluctuating throughout the day, and then it rises about 1 or 2 in the morning, and that's really been implicated in that late night eating, snacking, food craving aspect. All right, so ghrelin, growling of the stomach, makes you hungry. All right, and then PYY, GLP-1, and CCK. It's crazy that they all just have letters, and I'm sorry. But these are the satiety hormones that downstream, they're secreted in the gut, and they act in the brain to lead us to have feelings of satiety. And so we can measure those through blood sampling. We also do appetite and satiety questions throughout the day. The volunteers come in and they either skip breakfast or they have one of our breakfast meals. We give them a standardized lunch, and then we have some other procedures later in the day. And just keep in mind, the funny part with these studies is most of the teens will say, it seems like a day spa with a catheter. And my first response is, how do you even know what a day spa is? You're a teenager. Nonetheless, I think they just enjoy working with us because they have our undivided attention for like 8 hours. And so they just vent to the world about everything that's wrong in their life. And we have to listen because we're here. And so surprisingly, they don't really mind these at all. And so this is what we do for the most part of the day. And then one of the ways that we do to look at food cravings is we use something called functional MRI. All right, and what that is, it's allowing us to look at the neural responses in very specific regions of the brain that are tied into food cravings and food thoughts and food memories. All right, and so right before dinner time, we have them go into the brain scanner, and we show them highly appealing food pictures. And when you do that, it activates the regions that are called cortical limbic. And again, these are the ones that are food rewarding driven. All right. And the reason we do it right before dinner is because that's generally when teens feed. They come home from school, and from about 3 p.m. on to about 11 p.m., it's a feeding trough, right? It's this full feed snack, all you can eat type of thing. And so we were trying to see whether breakfast would significantly impact those drives to eat in the afternoon and in the evening hours. All right. And so once that brain scan's done, we give them an ad libitum dinner, and we send them out with a pack out cooler. It's full of unhealthy and healthy foods. Again, it's the feeding trough, and they can have as much or as little as they want throughout the rest of that day. All right. Again, with our hypothesis that we know that protein has this unique satiety effect. We also know that we think that breakfast is important. And so if we pair that, do you actually see, we're looking at it from a mechanism standpoint, but then also from practical outcomes. Can breakfast actually improve diet quality through reduced snacking? All right, so that's kind of the mindset that we have. These are just some of the pictures that we have. These are not the teens in our study. These happen to be a little bit older. They're young adults. But you can see here, this is the computer that they use. We're taking blood samples at the same time that they're eating I think this is a quesadilla. All right, and so they're on a very comfortable chair, and they're seemingly happy. All right, and they really are. I mean, we asked them to make sure. And so this is our FMRI, which I talked about, the brain scanner. So the volunteers go in. They put a head coil on that looks like a hockey mask. And then they see blurred images, which reset your neural responses. And they see 2 different types of pictures. There's animal pictures and there's food pictures. Both are pretty. So, pretty image. Your brain will light up. All right, literally, well, figuratively. And so what we do is we overlay the animals with the foods because both of them are appealing, but only the foods are appetizing. I grew up on a dairy farm, and we also had beef cows, so there's no cows, chickens, or pigs in our animals. All right, so these are the animals that by default, I think are not appetizing. All right, and so we overlay that because really the goal is just to look at food reward with the food pictures. All right, and that's how we're looking at food stimuli in the context of, does protein in the morning reduce these food cravings through these neural responses? All right, so that's what we have there. Here's some of the data that we have with this study. And so this is looking at perceived fullness or satiety throughout the 8-hour testing day. Time point 0 is whenever they either have breakfast or they skip breakfast. And then this is our standardized lunch. And then they're with us right before they go into the brain scanner. All right. The black here is the breakfast skipping. And the first thing that you can see when breakfast skippers continue to skip breakfast and they come in, they are not full. They are quite hungry. And that's a misnomer when people say, well, I skip because I'm not hungry. We're finding that there's other reasons why they skip. And the primary reason is that they stayed up too late. They get up and they have to go to school and they just don't have time to eat. All right. And so my default is I really should have been a sleep expert because this isn't helping me. Right. And so we're actually starting to look at some of those outcomes. But so they actually do come in. They're not full at all. And they are actually very hungry in the morning. And you can see here that they've had both of these breakfast meals that there's a significant increase in fullness. All right, and then there's a steady decline in the morning, but you can almost see at every time point that the higher protein breakfast led to a greater feeling of fullness compared to the normal protein version. And then following this standard protein lunch, you also start seeing differences. From a statistical standpoint, this is summing all these time points over that 8-hour period. And you can see here that the breakfast skipping is in black, normal protein is in blue, and then the high protein is in red. And you can see that both breakfast meals increase fullness across the day, rightly so. You're just giving them a breakfast meal. But the higher protein version leads to a greater feeling of fullness compared to the normal protein. All right, so again, really just targeting this concept of a single meal, which happens to be breakfast and protein in the morning, can significantly impact perceived feelings of fullness and satiety throughout the rest of the day. This is that gut hormone that I talked about. It's a satiety signal, PYY. All right. There's a lot of variability when you do repeated blood sampling. All right. So obviously, my disclaimer is that there are a large variability here. But what you do see visibly and statistically is that the higher protein breakfast led to this increase in PYY throughout the entire day. All right. You see how this is spiked up, whereas when they're breakfast skipping, PYY again is that satiety signal is lower, and then the normal protein is somewhere in the middle. All right, from a statistical standpoint, we see that only the high protein breakfast significantly elevated PYY, daily PYY concentrations compared to breakfast skipping, whereas the normal protein did not. It's somewhere in the middle. All right, so again, really supporting this idea of now we're starting to see the mechanisms of action that protein at breakfast leads to a feeling of satiety. It seems to do this through these gut responses, namely PYY. Ghrelin, we've also seen it in an opposite manner, but I will just, I think I have, I don't think I showed that today. For ghrelin, it decreased with a high protein breakfast across the day, more so compared to breakfast skipping, whereas the normal protein did not. All right, so if you're looking at it from a hunger standpoint, we again see that high protein breakfast can affect hunger through ghrelin. All right, and this is some of the data with the brain imaging. And so again, when the volunteers went in and we showed them these highly appealing food stimuli, we were looking at activation right before dinner time. And this is what happens when individuals are breakfast skipping and they are exposed to these food stimuli compared to just breakfast. And with breakfast, we combine normal protein and high protein. And what you see here is that there's activation in the hippocampus, the amygdala, and the middle frontal cortex when individuals are skipping breakfast. But these responses are blunted whenever the breakfast is consumed. Keep in mind, these are the regions that are not having to do with cognitive function and performance. So I don't want you to think, well, if I eat breakfast, I'm going to be brain dead and it's going to be a washout, right? No, these are the regions that are tied into food thoughts and food memories and food reward, food cravings. All right. And specifically, the hippocampus and the amygdala are really the ones that are giving you this idea that I am craving something like ice cream, high fat, high sugar. And the middle frontal is really, walking down to the refrigerator in the middle of the night or the freezer to actually have that ice cream. All right, conceptually. All right, so that's really what you're dealing with. Then when you also compare the normal protein breakfast versus the high protein breakfast, we again see that there's a decreased activation in the hippocampus and the parahippocampus following a high protein breakfast compared to the normal protein, right? You see there's activation here, but then these responses are blunted. All right, so now we're getting into this concept that, okay, well, protein has an effect from homeostatic eating behavior, but this is dealing with food cravings. We've also paired that with just asking them perceived feelings of food cravings, and when they have a high protein breakfast, they actually crave less fats throughout the day, high fatty foods. And so again, supporting this concept that there really is holistically affecting eating behavior. In terms of the practical aspects, and so this is that ad libitum pack out cooler, and this is literally what we gave them. And you can see that there's, anything under the sun. They really were privy into these monster drinks. So they had monster drinks. There's ice cream. We also had yogurt. We had beef jerky. We had tuna, healthy and unhealthy, Hot Pockets, anything you can imagine that they would eat in the afternoon and evening. That's what we had in this cooler. And so here's some of the data from that. This is looking at evening intake. And we specifically targeted the foods that were high in fat and high in sugar, the snacking. And we found that only the high protein breakfast reduced unhealthy, high fat, high sugar snacks compared to breakfast skipping, whereas the normal protein did not. All right. And when you look at this across the day, it actually shows that eating a high protein breakfast improves diet quality, and it does it through reducing these types of eating behaviors. All right. So that was our first series of studies. And then we really wanted to go more practical. And so we extended this out for a 12-week study. It was a randomized controlled trial. Having, again, all breakfast skippers. They either continued to skip breakfast, they had a normal protein breakfast or high protein breakfast for 12 weeks. The only thing that we did as far as the intervention is we provided these breakfast meals to them, but then they could have as many snacks or lunch and dinner portions as they wanted, but they had to eat our breakfast meals. And then we did body weight and body composition outcomes, daily food intake here. This is the dietary recalls. We used DEXA for body composition. And then we're also interested in looking at glycemic control. Because we know that glycemic control is also it has multiple health outcomes from a pre-diabetes standpoint, or the interaction between that and appetite and weight management. And so we use the continuous glucose monitors. The teens call it their research leech because it's really gets inserted in their abdomen, and it hangs out on there for 5 days. But it allows us to look at glucose every 5 minutes across the entire day for a 24-hour period, times 3 or 5. And so that's what we did in this study. So here's some of the data from that trial. So this is looking at changes in daily food intake across the intervention. Again, this is breakfast skipping, normal protein, and high protein. And what you can see here is, again, we only provided breakfast. Everything else was ad libitum. That the high protein breakfast group voluntarily reduced their daily food intake by about 400 calories compared to the breakfast skipping group, and then tended to be different compared to the normal protein group. All right, and these two were not different. So you can see here that it was eating protein in the morning. Think about it. We're actually adding another meal into a diet because they're breakfast skippers. When you do that, they still voluntarily reduce their daily food intake. And this type of data then lended itself to looking at changes in body fat loss. And so using DEXA, we found that the breakfast skippers actually gained body fat over the 12-week period, which supports that correlational data with breakfast skipping and obesity. All right, but the high protein breakfast actually prevented those fat gains over that 12-week period, whereas the normal protein did not. All right, so now we're starting to look at these practical outcomes in terms of this concept of eating more protein in the morning. In terms of the glycemic data, I have it broken up into 2 parts. This is the data that I have here, again, is looking at postprandial changes in glucose over a 24-hour period. These are in terms of, this is about 6 a.m. and 7 a.m., so when most of the teens were waking up. This was during the school, so they had to wake up. In the summers, it's a daunting task to try to get students to do these types of studies. So this was done in the school when they actually had to wake up. And you can see that this is the sleep interval. So they go to bed here, and then it kind of carries over. The black hash is when the volunteers are breakfast skipping. And then the red is after 12 weeks of consuming a high-protein breakfast. And a couple points that I want to make here is it's odd or interesting that while they're sleeping, their glucose is actually very, very high in the middle of the night, which I don't think anybody's actually seen. And these are non-diabetic teens. They are overweight or obese. They are trending to eventually be pre-diabetic, but they're not there yet. So it is interesting that they have this high level. When they wake up, their glucose is low. So from a clinical standpoint, if you were to do a fasting sample on them, you're not going to see that they have elevated glucose. But what you see here around the lunchtime hour, when they're given a standardized lunch, their glucose rise is really, really high. So it's not an advantageous response to a standard meal. And then you start seeing rises throughout the rest of the day. After 12 weeks of eating a high protein breakfast, you can see that almost at every time point, all of these responses are blunted. All right, if we think about it, the goal really is to maintain an even level of glycemic control throughout the day. And even around this lunchtime period, when they're eating the same lunch, you get a blunted response that is more even. From a statistical standpoint, anything that you want to imagine as far as outcomes, they were all different. 24-hour glucose variability, glucose fluctuations, which we know are predictors of the progression of type 2 diabetes, max responses, a time above a certain amount. All of these were reduced with a high-protein breakfast compared to breakfast skipping. We then compared the high-protein breakfast versus the normal protein, and we saw a very, very similar thing, that while a lot of variability here, that the high-protein breakfast blunted these responses compared to the normal protein version. All right, so again, really illustrating this idea of improvements in glycemic control. All right, so just to summarize, the addition of a high-protein breakfast containing about 30 grams of protein improves weight management, particularly in individuals who skip breakfast. Some of the mechanisms, as I talked about, is really this improvement in both homeostatic and hedonic eating behavior, and really targeting this idea of reducing snacking behavior throughout the day, particularly in the evening, with this high-protein breakfast. And then lastly, we see improvements in glycemic control. A couple key points that I want to mention, and I'm happy to field questions at the end. I didn't want to put them in due to time, but some of the things that we're also starting to look at is, are there other key protein-related factors for consideration? And the two that always come to mind is, one is protein quality, right? And so all of ours were mixed meals. The majority of our protein sources are animal-based, whether it's dairy, egg, or beef. I have had funding from the pork board, so sometimes it's lean pork loin. And so the question is, well, does it matter? Is animal better than plant-based proteins? And so since I asked the question, I guess I'll answer it real quick and go into more detail. Sorry, yeah, I know, I always do that. That's really bad, especially being a science teacher. That is, yeah. Anyways, long story short, we really just don't know for satiety. Most of the research that's out there, you'll see this conflicting evidence. A couple support it, some don't. And really, the general consensus is there's no differences between protein qualities. And I think it's because most of these studies are above this 30-gram threshold for satiety. And so I think even when you're mixing, you're matching your proteins, when you do that, whatever the satiety signal is from amino acid standpoint, which unfortunately I don't know. I mean, we don't know what the amino acid trigger is for satiety. Whichever it is, though, it seems as if when you're mixing your proteins, that if you're at a certain threshold for satiety, you don't see any differences. So the next question is, what happens if somebody only gets 20 grams of protein or 15 grams of protein? Does protein quality then matter, the sources that you have, depending on the amino acids? All right, and that's something that we're trying to look into. And then the last one is protein food form in terms of protein shakes and protein foods. I get asked that quite a bit. Really that being, I'm in a practical setting and I'm trying to recommend somebody for meal replacement shakes. Do they actually work? Well, when you look at the research, is yes, consistently, when you have somebody that's eating 1 or 2 meal replacement shakes a day and that's all they're eating, you do see a significant amount of weight loss. They generally don't track satiety with that. But the caution that I have for that from a weight management standpoint, it's very rare that a study actually compares the shakes to a solid food, like typical meals. And our data would suggest that when somebody's eating their protein, they get a far bigger increase in satiety and actually reduce their food intake compared to whenever that protein is consumed as a beverage. When they do that, in essence, when you're drinking your protein, it actually goes through the gut quicker. And so it doesn't have time to actually activate those satiety signals, which then downstream, you just don't get an elevated level of satiety. Now, are protein shakes great for other things? Yes. Post-workout, fantastic, right? You want it to actually go through the body quicker. For older folks who actually just can't eat that much protein or have dentition issues, having shakes in the morning or throughout the day are fantastic. Cancer patients also. Anybody that has compromised appetite and satiety, they work great. But honestly, from a weight management and an appetite standpoint, it is really best to eat your food if you can. All right, so I've answered that one too. Sorry. At least then we don't have to raise your hand. And so with that, I just wanted to thank my co-investigators who've worked with me over the years. I will acknowledge I didn't add it on the front end, but my funding, I've had consistent funding from the Beef Checkoff, the Egg Nutrition Center, Pork Checkoff, Kellogg's, and NIH. And just a point with a lot of the Checkoff programs, because some of you may or may not know, I mean, they've really been instrumental to me as a young investigator, providing pilot data that has allowed me now to get NIH funding. And for those of you that really don't know how they work, generally they are all investigator initiated. So a call comes out for a global topic. We submit our proposals. They get sent out for external review from scientists around the country or at times even around the world. The feedback comes back, and then they, based on the priority score, we get funding. And it is very hands off. It is very much like NIH that we send updates, but that literally is what they are. Is that we're on task. At the end, we submit a final report that doesn't get peer reviewed back and forth. That the investigator submits it. And then, we submit abstracts to experimental biology or FENCI or those things that we turn them into a manuscript. And, we send the different organizations copies of those manuscripts. So it is very hands off. But I can tell you, I wouldn't have been, I don't know if I'm successful or not. At some point, I think I am, but you never know. But I feel like, without that, I wouldn't have been able to get enough funding or enough data, pilot data to actually continue this forward. And so I just want to acknowledge that because it has been very instrumental for me. And then my grad students as well. And I just want to end with my main take-home ditty. It says, if it could only be this easy, thanks to his pop-up fullness indicator, Andy was able to leave the table satisfied, not stuffed. And so obviously we need one of these, right? And I laughed because I didn't actually make this ditty, but he ate all his protein and he left his potatoes, right? So that is the pop-up indicator at its best. And so with that, just want to thanks for your time. And if we have a couple minutes, I'm happy to field some questions. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Lacey. I'm the district dietitian for Dickinson ISD. And I was wondering, what is the background of why there's not a meat alternate requirement for the federal school breakfast program?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So I just presented I just presented in behalf of the New York Dairy Council to a school-based presentation last week in Rochester, and I'm sitting next to all the school-based folks that actually do the meal developments, and they're looking at my research. I'm like, well, that's fantastic. And they look down at what they give, and they're like, that's pathetic. And so, I think they a lot of the food service people within the schools and those that are actually controlling that understand it. It's just from a USDA or FDA standpoint, they're just not allowing that to happen. And honestly, I think it's because there's not a lot of research driving breakfast. And so one of the comments that I have gotten back from my research is, yes, we need to do these with larger term studies. And so the NIH grant that I'm getting ready to start is 150 kids for 6 months, really showcasing this, reducing protein a little bit to make it more manageable. And I think it's the more times we do those types of studies could theoretically make policy changes for having more protein in the morning. But it's a challenge because of the cost that it's been perceived in terms of meats or eggs and dairy within the school system. And so honestly, I think I always say, well, stay tuned, because particularly being a teacher at one point and then having a child in school, their breakfast programs are just not as good as what I think they could be. And I think the research is now starting to come out. And so I think it's just the more people that are doing this type of research, hopefully, I mean, that's really the goal for most scientists, is to take this and then make it so that you actually are developing policy changes that we don't do, but the people that are seeing our research actually does and takes it from there. So a really good point.
Thanks for the great talk. It was wonderful. My name is Roberta Anding, and I'm a sports dietitian in Houston. In your adolescent studies, did you ever control for Tanner staging? And do you think that would be anything significant?
Yeah, so no. And the only reason we didn't, and it's because it's a daunting task for teens, and it generally has them shy away from research when they know that they're going to have their Tanner stages done. We were trying to make them also more generalized. We do assess menstrual status. So the majority of my studies have been in girls. The biggest reason is because they skip breakfast more than guys. So the earlier ones have been in the girls. We did assess the fact that they had menstrual cycles for at least 6 months before they started the study. So theoretically, the growth spurt aspect of that is gone to the wayside. We use that same model in our long-term trials, just using that same age. But you're right, boys generally have shifted Tanner staging, and so it could have been that part. In my NIH grant, we are doing that within that trial. So the acute term trials, you do what you can to get, we wanted as much compliance as possible, and those have a tendency to shy kids away. So to your point, but as a side note, we wear different hats depending on who you're talking to. These are in adolescents. Our range was 13 to 19, but I'm not going to kid you that 90% of them are about 18 to 19 years of age. So when you put that in perspective, they were, for the most part, already through their Tanner stages. And so most people say, well, is this data generalized to adults? Well, an 18 or 19-year-old, it's as good as you're going to get from that. And, teens, we can kind of play in that world too. And so this is in the middle ground. My other study will actually be targeting younger kids to try to change that. So thank you.
Thank you.